Welcome to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp, President of Sharp Research and Translation. Our show today, China's Nuclear Posture, and our guest is Dr. Lora Saalman, Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Dr. Saalman's primary expertise is on China, but she's also highly conversant on Russian and Indian affairs. She received her PhD at Tsinghua University in China. All instruction was in Chinese, and in fact, her dissertation was written in Chinese. She has a number of publications in both English and Chinese, and I'm really looking forward to today's show because I'm sure we're going to all learn a lot. Welcome to ThinkTech Asia.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Bill.
It's great. Well, let's all get started off on the right foot here. What's China's nuclear posture?
Well, I think, China for a number of years now has been somewhat of an unusual nuclear power. And I say that because they've been really restrained in the amount to which they've built up their nuclear arsenal, as opposed to other countries, like, for example, the United States. Russia, of course, had massive arsenals during the Cold War. By most estimates for the United States, during the height of the Cold War, they had about 31,000 weapons. So, of course, we're at much lower numbers now. But China, from its very start in the 1960s, had a very restrained posture.
Well, let me clarify something. 31,000 weapons, which is that Russia or the United States or combined?
That's the United States alone.
Okay.
So if you add in the Russia component to that as well, you're talking about close to 60, 70,000 weapons.
When you say weapons, we're talking about warheads.
Warheads, yeah.
Okay.
So in the Chinese case, from 1964, when they conducted their first test, they were very explicit about the fact that they would follow certain tenets. One of these was no first use, so that China would not be the country to first use nuclear weapons in a conflict. It would only be in response. They also have another tenet within their posture, which essentially says that they will retain a limited or minimum credible deterrent. There is some speculation about just how limited that deterrent has become over the years, but by most estimates, it's somewhere between 240 to, I've seen estimates as high as 400.
Let me drop in a question
Sure.
here. As you said, China's basic tenet, at least when it started off, when it first created its own nuclear doctrine, was that China would never be the nation to first use nuclear weapons. Is that still true?
Well, by most accounts today, it is still true, at least within their official rhetoric, within their official posture. There has been a debate as of recent, I would say probably a year or two, particularly as it pertains to their white paper, because they released in the past year a shortened version of their normal white paper. In fact, they gave it a new title. And in doing so, they left out the section that they normally include in their white papers, which pertains to their no first use posture. So that leaving that out has led to some questions.
Omission.
Yes, but the entire section is left out. My personal contention is perhaps this indicates that behind closed doors, there is an evaluation or perhaps a reevaluation of China's no first use posture. However, officially speaking, they have not changed it.
You know, China's foreign policy was first created after liberation in 1949. China was sealed off from the world, isolated from the world, with the assistance of the United States and by its own designs, I think it's fair to say. And a basic tenet of Chinese foreign policy at that time was never to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. And I think that's certainly changing, or perhaps has changed. It sort of depends on who you talk to what degree they will suggest that it has changed. And now we're seeing this aspect, this traditional aspect of PRC, foreign policy, under review. And you think about things like there's been so much a reasonable amount of discussion in Beijing about, well, China, maybe it should scrap its defense treaty with North Korea, something that's pretty traditional in PRC foreign policy. So Chinese foreign policy is going through changes. I'm not sure we always appreciate that.
No, I think, and another thing to appreciate is that despite the fact, of course, that it is a one-party system, that there is a plurality of voices within that system. The PLA is, of course, still under control of the Central Military Commission and the party itself. However, that being said, there is some flexibility there, I think, particularly in terms of the internal debate. However, I do want to emphasize that when it comes to no first use, they have, of course, not relinquished this within official circles. I think that within generally speaking, though, China is on this trajectory that they will have to start to reevaluate some of these postures. In particular, their numbers, the no first use, demating is another.
What's that term?
Demating.
What's that?
It's demating essentially says that they will keep their warheads separated from their delivery systems. This is something of what's once again started from the 1960s. Other countries keep their arsenals, not all of them, but a few, on launch on warning, which means that, of course, in a conflict scenario, if you have to be able to launch quickly, you already have your warhead mated to your delivery system. In the Chinese case, they keep them separate. However, as they're developing their nuclear submarine program, basically that will have to change, because if you're going to send these off to sea, you can't leave them demated and dock in order to load up your nuclear warheads onto your missiles.
Here I am, the big missile expert here, but as far as I understand, to mate or to mount a warhead onto a missile delivery system, it takes some time. I mean, it's not something that can just be done in a few minutes. Exactly,
and so in a conflict or a crisis scenario, the question is, would China want to, first of all, take that time? Would that be escalatory? For example, perhaps there hasn't been an exchange yet, or, you know, God forbid that there is an exchange. But in that lead up to this potential crisis, would that send signals to the other side if they, of course, start loading these onto their systems? If they're already mated on the nuclear submarine, then that could actually create, I think it's both stabilizing and destabilizing. There is an argument it might be stabilizing in some circles.
That's a very interesting point. Stabilizing in the respect that the other side really wouldn't know what their time advantage, if any, were.
Exactly, and so that's basically what contributes to the whole concept of deterrence and to the whole concept of survivability, because ultimately that's what China has been in pursuit of since the start.
Okay. Wow, so much to think about here. Recently, I heard, within the last few months, that China has now developed its MIRV, okay, help me out here. Multiple...
Independently targetable reentry vehicles.
There we go.
Right.
Okay. And this is supposed to really ramp up the technological level of Chinese nuclear weaponry and weaponry. Is that really true?
Well, I think, once again, it feeds back into this concept of survivability. The whole concept of a MIRV, of course, is that you have up to, usually between 6 to 10 nuclear warheads on one ballistic missile. So
how many kiloton would those be?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on the aims, and it depends on basically the distance that they wish to fly. Because obviously you have a trade-off. The bigger your payload, then obviously the less far that you can fly. Now, these missiles in and of themselves, for example, the DF-41, which you've probably heard some reports about in terms of their testing, that is thought to be a MIRV system. Now, if
the DF-41, does that does that make the D-21F obsolete?
No, no.
Because we heard so much of that for so long.
Exactly. Well, the DF-21D is an entirely different system, since it's used as it's known as the aircraft carrier killer, right? That's its concept, the DF-21D.
Okay.
There are other variants, though. It's always important to remember with these missile systems that they have, after those numbers, a letter. A, B, C, D, and so on. And so those variants, each of them has a different capability, a different skill set. So the DF-41 in particular, a lot of people have been speculating about this weapon for a number of years. The fact that there have been reports about it being tested and even some confirmation within China that it's been tested and that it exists is a huge development. Why do I say that? Because in some circles, and many circles, they would say that this actually contributes to its ability to break through ballistic missile defense.
Okay, let's put this in layman's terms here. The DF-41 is an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Correct.
Okay, delivery system. All right, we're sitting here in Hawaii. They say the North Koreans can hit Hawaii, so I guess the DF-41 can hit Hawaii. Hawaii is within range of the DF-41.
It is, but actually for hitting Hawaii, they would probably select a different missile. For the DF-41, they're looking more at the continental, the United States. So they're looking at, you know, a much bigger range. To give you a concept or an idea of this, the longest range missile that the United States has deployed in the past is the Minuteman III. Those particular systems can go for 15,000 kilometers.
Is that still the leading U.S. delivery system?
It is one of The
One
systems,
of-
we also have the Tridents systems as well. However, the Minuteman in and of itself is about 15,000 kilometers in range.
Okay.
It used to be MIRVed. The reports that I've seen recently say that it is no longer MIRVed, the United States variant. The Chinese, in their ability to deploy a MIRV variant of the DF-41, it's basically, why is it so important for prestige reasons, in addition to all these other regions, is the fact that it actually rivals the United States Minuteman systems that it's had in the past.
Why isn't a MIRV on that, what was it, the Minuteman?
On the Minuteman?
Yeah, well, I mean, isn't a MIRV supposed to be sort of the cutting edge of nuclear warheads?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the cutting edge. I think that, you know, most of these technologies, let's not forget with nuclear technology in general, ballistic missiles or nuclear warheads or otherwise, it really dates back in a lot of cases to the 1960s, including in the case of the United States. These systems have been around for a very long time, including MIRV systems in the case of the United States and Russia. But for countries like China, it is a big emerging technology because obviously they haven't possessed it in the past.
When was it? When I'm never sure of the time span, I say 5 years because that sounds safe. So let's say 5 years ago or so, there was a lot of concern in the media that this one scientist, I think it was from Los Alamos, he was a Chinese American, naturalized U.S. citizen, had essentially sold MIRV technology to China.
Well, it depends on the
remember that
report.
case?
Are you talking about the Cox report that came out about the
wasn't
W-88?
you know, right now, on top of my tongue, I can't think of this guy's name. He had done his training at Texas A&M. I believe his last name was Lee.
Wenli Ho.
Yeah, there we go. I think that the case was thrown out at a later point, although there was one charge that stuck. Is it reasonable to say that China got its MIRV technology from the U.S. via espionage?
Well, you know, there's a great deal of speculation about espionage cases when it comes to both the United States and its posture in other countries, and China, and of course, vis-a-vis the United States. And I'm sure you've seen the Mandiant report about advanced persistent threat. Basically, advanced persistent threat can occur in a number of different forms. One of the most commonly cited groups, however, is that PLA unit that you've probably been reading about, the 61398 unit. Most of the espionage that we hear about typically has to do with industrial espionage. In other words, they're spying on U.S. companies.
Cyber
In the cyber espionage. However, this also does involve U.S. defense contractors in a number of cases. Lockheed Martin is a perfect example.
Right.
So yes, that has been going on. I don't think that there has been necessarily, despite the denials, I think that there is a degree to which there's this understanding that espionage does occur between countries. But the view on it's very different. When it comes to the nuclear arsenal, however, you know, whether or not China received that information that led directly to its MIRV technology from the United States, it's hard for me to make that claim because it could have also gotten it from Russia as well. A number of nuclear scientists from the former Soviet Union actually went into China and trained a number of their experts. Yeah, so there's a number of channels through which China can get technology, like any country. Also, they have a great deal of cooperation with Israel in aerospace technology as well. So it could come from a number of different vectors.
That's interesting. China, I suppose this is a variant on Chinese salami slicing, but it seems the way they do their espionage is they take a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, and then they all kind of put it together. Whereas it seems other countries' espionage is, well, we go for the big grab here, and we don't sort of parcel it out, which it seems is China's approach.
Well, I think that, you know, in terms of tactics, obviously, China, in terms of its approach, I think that You know, first of all, I think it's also important that we differentiate between the very concerted efforts within the cyber sphere to garner information. I think that happens across the boards among any number of countries. I think the Chinese approach actually, if that is their concerted effort, and I'm not saying it is or it isn't, I think that there is a tendency or an ability that they have. I think it's a smart one, actually, right? If you want to limit your damage, limit your detection of other parties, you're going to take bits and pieces rather than necessarily go for broke with one large cache of information.
I believe it reduces the blowback factor.
Exactly.
As well. A question that occurred to me is, well, you were mentioning like the Minuteman and a few other missiles. What about, what's it called, the Vanguard system?
The Vanguard system?
Maybe I'm thinking of something else. The Vanguard. I might be thinking of some other sort of NASA project rather than, you know, a more military type one.
Well, perhaps what you might be thinking of is within NASA and also within actually Boeing itself, they've been engaged in a number of developments in boost glide and hypersonic test vehicles. Perhaps that's some of the Falcon program might be what you're referring to. Oh, okay.
That's in my mind.
Okay.
Okay, we're talking about warheads here. And let me just make sure I understand this. In other words, MIRV is not the most sophisticated way to go about nuclear warheads in today's world.
Well, I think that, you know, in terms of sophistication and delivery systems, actually some of those systems that I just mentioned, if you were going to use those in terms of boost glide, that actually is kind of the cutting edge, the new Vanguard, so to speak, of the future.
The Vanguard.
Yeah.
That word comes in useful in one way or the other. Yeah.
But in terms of MIRVs, of course, it has a certain degree of technological sophistication. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the next level that China has been striving to reach among other countries. It also just allows them a great deal more flexibility because you're not just relying on one target. That's part of the reason it can break through things like ballistic missile defenses, right? Because it's much harder to target multiple warheads that are all going in different directions than it would be just one.
We're coming up here on break, but let me quickly stick this question in here, and then we'll go to break. On a MIRV, are all the warheads real warheads, or are there some decoys or so-called dummies in there as well?
There have been suggestions that, of course, that would be an option for a country, particularly if they're not looking to weigh down their ballistic missile with such a large payload so that they can actually travel farther, and also so that they can confuse those ballistic missile defenses that might be targeting that system. Great.
Well, I think we'll take our break here. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Lora Saalman, Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. And we've been having a very interesting conversation about China's nuclear posture. We'll be right back.
Okay, I'm Jay Fidel, that's Ray Starling. We co-host a show called Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. It's really interesting. You know, Ray has a way of unzipping these guys. He asks them these questions and all this stuff tumbles out, and we find out stuff we would never know about without Ray's questions. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, Jay. I'm very pleased to be your Ed McMahon every Wednesday at 4 o'clock here on the internet. So you can join us and see what's happening in the energy world, and there is a lot going on. So join us every Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, come around, be energized right here on ThinkTech. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Lora Saalman, Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. She's a real expert on China's nuclear doctrine, Chinese nuclear affairs, nuclear weaponry to be exact. And we've been talking about a number of things, including Chinese nuclear warheads as well as delivery systems. Where should we start? Did you want to say something?
Oh, perhaps just my disclaimer that I forgot to mention at the beginning. While I work for the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, obviously that is an educational institution within the Department of Defense, but all these views that I'm expressing today are my own and not those of the U.S. government or the Department of Defense. So Thank you.
Traditionally, U.S., how should I say, nuclear doctrine, nuclear posture has been based on the triad. Okay, nuclear weapons on board submarines, drop from bombers, and also missiles, missile delivery. Does China have a similar idea or triad-like idea?
Well, China has been definitely working towards its nuclear triad. I would say that if there was any aspect of it that was a little bit weaker or hasn't been prioritized at the same level, it would probably be their bombers. While they do have the Hong series of bombers, it's not exactly high on their priority list. Instead, what they've really been looking at is their sea-based and land-based deterrence.
Okay, okay. All right, we're sitting here in America, and of course, we know that China has nuclear weapons, that some of which are probably aimed at the United States, or could easily be aimed at the U.S. But who else might China be aiming at?
Well, of course, there's a good deal of speculation about that as well. And when we use the term aiming, I think it's important to be really accurate about that, because in terms of aiming, it would indicate that a country has targeted another country. Now, despite the fact that China, of course, has certain countries in mind, like the United States, in terms of targeting, part of the, one of the things that they pride themselves on is that they do not have launch on warning, where you actually have logged into your targeting systems who you're facing your missiles at any given moment, right? As I mentioned before, they demate their systems, or demate their warheads from their delivery systems. So
Is that a two-step process? In other words, you have to mate the warhead to the delivery system, and then you have to program in the launch codes and that kind of thing? Essentially,
yeah. Now, of course, that is all, I would still say, a fairly streamlined process. They're not going to allow it to languish in the interim between the time where they've been struck and when they wish to strike and strike back. But at the same time, I think that their processes are a lot more deliberate and are not so automatic. And that is something that China has prided itself on. What I mentioned earlier, however, I wanted to also emphasize and that I think is an important point as well, is that as China does develop some of these newer capabilities, it is going to force them to come back and reevaluate some of their postures, some of these processes that I've just been talking about. So nothing is fixed, it's not going to remain that way forever.
When I think about countries that China might be concerned about or have at least some doctrine or, for lack of a better term, battle plan to use nuclear weapons against, I would think of like India, Japan, Russia, although on one hand it tries to present the image that it's, good friends with Russia. On the other hand, I wonder about that. Taiwan.
Well, I think another important point of China's posture historically has been that they have negative security assurances. Now, negative security assurances in basic parlance are that they will not target a country which does not have nuclear weapons power. So first of all, if we're talking about Taiwan, of course they're not looking at that as a country. And they're also not looking at it as a nuclear weapons power either. So they wouldn't necessarily have, at least within their nuclear posture, a contingency for Taiwan. The contingency for Taiwan would involve the United States involvement or another country's involvement potentially, but not targeting of Taiwan itself. Does that make sense?
I see, yeah. In other words, the U.S. would become the target.
Exactly. If the United States were to get, involved, then it was a huge escalation. Now, we're of course positing a massive escalation here for them to actually threaten to use nuclear weapons. But the other thing is so for other countries like Japan as well, the contingencies that they would have would be non-nuclear contingencies. They're more likely to be conventional weaponry contingencies. This is why the DF-21D is so important, because these are, of course, systems that are to be used in a conventional capacity. They can, now that system is supposed to be nuclear
conventional
capable.
Capacity, in other words, they would not have nuclear warheads.
That is the idea. However, they are capable. You can mount a nuclear warhead onto those systems.
A sort of a hybrid system.
It is a hybrid system, but most systems are, in fact, hybrid. It's all about how you fit them in terms and whether or not you have miniaturization capabilities, which we know China has.
Here's a wild card question for you. North Korea is a nuclear power.
In terms of China
It has
nuclear posture.
nuclear capability.
But no,
It's on China's border, and
Yes.
I don't think they're as friendly as they once were.
Yes, there's definitely been some, I would say some, you mentioned the word blowback earlier. There has been some blowback for North Korean activities in the region, particularly vis-a-vis China. Now, how they define a country with nuclear weapons, and this is a really interesting point. When we talk about India, right, when we talk about North Korea, Israel, countries like this that we all know, for all intents and purposes, have nuclear weapons, they're still not recognized nuclear weapon states. So there is a tendency within China to make a distinction there. In terms of the countries not signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they do not tend to look at them in their conventional sense of what is a nuclear weapon state. This is why when they say that they have negative security assurances vis-a-vis these other powers, there's a question within India. You know, where does India fit in, for example? Or, you know, among their other neighbors, because if it's not being recognized as a nuclear weapon state, then how does that change China's posture? The area last point on this, territorially speaking, this is the reason that there has been another question. You mentioned Taiwan earlier. If we talk about Arunachal Pradesh in India, these are areas of contestation. They're seen as, within China, of course, as being their territory, their zone. Now, under that concept of negative security assurances, that applies to another power, another country. It does not necessarily apply to your own territory. So the rub of all of this is within India, within Taiwan. There's been some debate about, well, are they covered by that negative security assurance where China would not attack them, say, with nuclear weapons? This is all semantics, though. Whether or not this actually, you know, I think a lot of it, and a lot of things that have to do with deterrence really come down to semantics sometimes. It's not always the most practical discussion to have, but it's still going on.
I'll have to digest that.
Sure.
Okay, does Xi Jinping walk around with a PLA officer following him with that proverbial black case of launch codes in him and carried in there, you know, handcuffed to his wrist, just like is the case with Obama?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have never been that close to Xi Jinping. I've never noticed if he had a briefcase with him, but I do know that.
Or one of his attendants in the background carrying around a kind of heavy but obvious case, heavy and obvious case.
Given the fact that, given what their no first use policy is, given the posture that they have at this current time, at the official level, given the fact that they do not have launch on warning, that there are also questions in terms of what their permission action links are. Which is essentially for launch codes, you know, since there are those questions, it's thought that they have a two-man system like you saw in war games, right, where they both turn the key at the same moment. There are things within the system which are not entirely clear. What is clear, however, is that the decision-making authority, the command and control, will come up through the Central Military Commission. Xi Jinping, as the paramount leader, is not just the leader of the party, is not just the leader of the country, he's also the leader of the Central Military Commission.
Right.
So he would have that decision-making authority. Whether or not that, you know, takes the form of a briefcase or him just giving verbal authority is another question.
Let's come back to that, because that's a really interesting question. We have to take another break. This is ThinkTech Asia. My name is Bill Sharp. I'm your host here. My guest today is Dr. Lora Saalman, Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and we're having a very interesting discussion concerning China's nuclear posture. And we'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Lora Saalman, Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and we've been having a very informative discussion about China's nuclear posture. let's get back to that decision making. Okay, so in other words, it's just not Xi Jinping that can say, okay, let's launch him. Does he have to have the consensus of the other members of the Central Military Commission? I mean, Xi Jinping is beginning to look, well, not beginning, is more and more of a strong leader who seems to do a lot of things on his own initiative. It said that he even kind of runs over Li Keqiang, doesn't consult him on a lot of issues. So is it something that he can do by himself on his own authority?
Well, you know, I've certainly been following Xi Jinping's ascent into power, and of course, as we all know, in terms of his corruption, anti-corruption campaigns and other things, and also in terms of his consolidation of power, I think that certainly he's been taking some great strides in that regard. He's been making some big efforts. How this impacts nuclear posture, though, and basic nuclear operationalization is a different question. You know, it's hard for me to answer in some ways because China still remains, for all intents and purposes, fairly opaque, particularly on this point. And as I had just mentioned,
on this point,
especially
very,
on this point,
secretive, yeah.
Because when, you know, and this is part of the reason I highlighted at the very beginning that whole issue of their defense white papers. It used to be that a number of Chinese experts, in fact, would emphasize the fact that China was transparent when it came to its intent, not its capabilities. So they said, well, we have no first use.
That's
we have all
really
these
good way to
things.
put it. And I think that description can be applied to several aspects of China.
Yeah, and I think that it has historically held up, you know, because they were very, you know, transparent about the negative security assurances, about the no first use, about their demating policy, credible minimum deterrent. All of those things that we really take as core principles within China have been held up over the years. However, that's why I think that looking at their defense white paper over the past few years and that evolution where I've seen, and I've been tracking this, from 2008 where it had 14 sections to 2010 then when it had about, I think, around 10 sections, and now where it has about 5 sections in this most recent iteration that I mentioned, I've seen a steady shrinking, I think, in the amount of intent that we are privy to. And I think that that is really borne out in terms of their arms control policy and nuclear posture. It's very hard, I would argue, to make the argument over, say, a 40, 50-year period that your posture has not changed, and yet your arsenal in terms of MIRVs, in terms of your conventional arsenal as well, has been changing, and it's by leaps and bounds.
What about the 2nd Artillery? We hear so much about the 2nd Artillery, probably the most talked about unit in the PLA. I have this impression it's modeled after the Russian strategic rocket forces. I don't know if that's accurate or not, though.
Well, I think that there was certainly from its inception, China has looked towards Russia and towards the former Soviet Union for how it modeled a good deal of its PLA and its 2nd Artillery. I think that it would be an apt comparison. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily a one-to-one comparison, but I think that there are a lot of parallels that could be drawn there. One of the things that's always struck me as interesting about the 2nd Artillery, though, is the fact that this is a community which is really responsible for both the strategic nuclear arsenal of the country in terms of those ballistic missiles, but also for its conventional. And so you basically have one set of people with two very divergent policies, two very divergent postures. What do I mean by that? In the nuclear realm, in the strategic realm, what they're talking about is no first use, this idea of no preemption, you know. But within the conventional side, if we're talking about the DF-21D, if we're talking about a lot of these systems, the WU-14 tests, you know, these hypersonic tests and boost glide, these systems that are really coming down the pike, these are more preemptive type systems because there is lacking that taboo. There's a nuclear taboo, right, against nuclear weapons use, and thank goodness we have it. But in the conventional realm, you don't really have that taboo. Its first strike basically means that you gain the advantage, whether that be in cyber, whether that be with an ASAT or an anti-satellite.
Okay.
Whether that be also with some of these missile systems, a cruise missile system, a high precision system. These are the types of things that you use preemptively. So what concerns me when I look at the second artillery is the fact that you have an organization that's responsible for both. And where is the line drawn? How do you keep those two very divergent postures from intersecting?
I would suspect that since the second artillery combines two functions, conventional and non-conventional, that the non-conventional sort of has the upper hand.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, you're dealing with a set of people where obviously, I can't say what the breakdown is because once again, we're dealing with opacity issues.
Sure.
But at the same time, too, the hope is that the people who are in charge of, one side of this equation and the other are able to maintain a certain amount of distance. What is always, though, a concern with any military, I would say, is crossover.
Right.
Rarely does someone stay within one functional unit for their entire career.
Right.
And so I think there is a good deal of crossover. So in this regard, at least
we might call that cross-training.
Cross-training, exactly. So I mean, with the one thing that I would say that having at least the Central Military Commission there does provide a superstructure over the second artillery, at least in terms of decision making. And that can be very important because you don't necessarily want within this cross-trained environment someone making the decisions regarding, say, the strategic or the conventional arsenal.
A question I meant to ask you before is Chinese delivery systems, okay? How are they fueled? Okay, now this question might go back a ways, but are they like solid fuel, liquid fuel?
They've been trending towards solid fuel.
Okay.
Most countries, I would say, well, I can't say most, but a number of countries, when they first start off, they start off with, say, liquid fueled systems, and then they move into solid fuel. The big difference between the two, of course, is that with a liquid fuel system, you can't leave them loaded.
It takes a long time to load them, doesn't it?
Exactly. So you have to fill it.
If you have to mate it and you have to fuel it, we're talking about more and more time.
Exactly. And so if it's a solid fueled system, then of course you have that ability to launch right away.
What sort of material would be used in solid fuel?
In terms of the exact
would it be what's the essence of solid fuel? What's solid fuel made of?
Well, it depends once again on the country in terms of the mixture.
More in China's case.
In China's
generally
case,
speaking.
In China's case, I'm not sure exactly what they would be using.
Okay. Yeah, I know the term, but I don't know anything beyond it.
Okay, sure.
Okay. One thing that makes China's missiles kind of tricky for the U.S. and other concerned countries would be that a lot of them are mobile, aren't they? They can be easily moved from one area to another area. And, they're not necessarily fixed.
Well, and in terms of survivability, which once again is China's priority, they have been moving towards this idea of having a road mobile system, and they have, of course, throughout time actually been at the forefront of moving these systems around the country. There are questions, of course, when they're moving these larger canisters around, are they filled? Do you actually have a ballistic missile inside, or do they leave them empty? But interestingly, it's been pointed out by, I think, people like Mark Stokes, some other people who've been doing research on China for a number of years now, that there are surprisingly fewer sites than they might expect in terms of launch. Meaning that you can pretty much pinpoint that if there's going to be a launch, where it's going to be coming from. In the interim, however, they keep these missiles in constant motion throughout the country because it allows them that flexibility. It makes it harder to target in terms of, say, an external preemptive strike. I've also understood or heard from a number of Chinese experts who are working in this field that in terms of U.S. satellites, they work in concentric circles. As those circles come up against each other, you're still left with a zone which is not covered. So there's an effort within China also to stay in that zone, which the satellites have a hard time to reach because it makes it, once again, that much harder to preempt and to strike. The whole concept of nuclear primacy, which came out with, I believe it was in an article a few years ago, has really resonated within China. And the whole concept of nuclear primacy is that the United States might conduct a disarming strike against China or Russia, and that would give it the upper hand.
You mentioned Mark Stokes. Mark Stokes has been on the show as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So many areas we have yet to cover, but there's just not enough time to go to them all, so we have to decide what to do here. The X-37, what is that? I don't understand what it is. I pick up these snippets about it in the news every once in a while, but I really don't understand what that is.
Sure. Well, it basically is an extenuation of a program. Remember I mentioned earlier that quite frequently with these programs that there will be a number and then A, B, C, and D variant. So the X-37 is no different.
Okay.
But in essence, it's a space plane, and it came out through a NASA program. There have been NASA programs. There have also been an X-51. There's a variety of different systems that have come down the pike as space planes. And that one in particular is one that operates, the X-37, is operating on a gliding principle. And so with that technology, this has really captivated, I would say, the Chinese audience. It's a US developed system, but as China has been pursuing their own variants of these types of systems, predominantly because it's in regards to conducting a strike, it's very hard to target because you glide into your final targeting zone, right? And so it doesn't follow a fixed trajectory. Is it supposed to deliver a weapon? It can deliver a weapon. I'm not saying the X-37 is intended to deliver a weapon, but it has that potentiality. It's a capability. Okay. Like all of these things are capabilities. It's how you choose to use them.
The Chinese do seem to be quite worried about that.
They are, and I think that in largest part because they're looking at a lot of these systems, particularly the X-51, in fact, which can operate in low orbit, and that can also, at their final trajectory, like the X-37, glide into their final zone. And that gliding process really is different from a ballistic missile. Why is it different from a ballistic missile? A ballistic missile follows a set trajectory, a set in terms of its re-entry into the atmosphere. These others, if they're mounted on, say, a ballistic missile or released from a spacecraft or a plane or otherwise, that gliding motion is not fixed. And so that makes it that much harder to target. As I mentioned earlier, ballistic missile defense, detection, and also I would say in terms of ballistic missile defense, once again, it's an important system. It's driving a lot of developments both within China and within Russia.
Is there such a thing as mapping of space?
Well, yes.
One person I talked to, and this is sort of a very casual conversation, he happened to be retired from the Air Force, so I thought he might know something about this, and he was telling me the X-37 is designed to map space, but I really didn't know whether that was valid or that was just a guess on his part.
Well, no, I think that actually I don't think it's just one system, but I think that they have a number of different purposes. And I think that the X-37, like these other systems, has a variety of different aims. The issue is how it's being perceived by the other side. And so I think that in the Chinese case, of course, they're going to worst case scenario any of these systems. Regardless of what its stated intent is, once again we get to intent and actual capabilities, regardless of that, they're going to be ascribing to it a potential weaponization or weaponized form.
Okay, well, we're sort of coming down here to the end of the show. We have about 3 minutes left, and maybe this is a little bit of an unfair question to ask you right at the end. But, okay, is there going to be, on the horizon, is there any possibility of this sort of a nuclear arms limitation talk between the United States and China? And I realize, as I suggest, I'm probably being a little unfair asking this right at the end. But is there a possibility, or is this something that perhaps China wants to wait till a later time when perhaps it has a nuclear arsenal and capability that's more equivalent to the United States?
You know, it's a huge question. It's a very important question. I am, at this current juncture, I wouldn't say I'm entirely optimistic about that. Why do I say this? Because when we look at the United States developments and Russian developments, particularly in terms of nuclear modernization, when we look at the fact that Russia is also pursuing, in terms of its deterrence posture, some new shifts, I think and new developments in terms of tailored forms of deterrence, tactical nuclear weapons, it makes it very hard to convince China to come to the table.
Well, thank you very much, and it was a great show, and I really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. I'm your host, Bill Sharp, here on ThinkTech Asia. Our guest today has been Dr. Lora Saalman, Associate Professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and she's taught us all quite a bit about China's nuclear posture. I just wish we had more time because there's always more to talk about, but we'll see you next week.